Hey there, and welcome back to another Bridgerton video. We're almost there, almost at the final part of Season 3, good god I'm hyped. I just did a rewatch of the first part of the season, and I think it goes a lot better on a rewatch as it lets you appreciate it all a bit more. On that first watch through, I think you're overly eager for that main storyline to the point that I think a lot of people put their blinders on, and they stop caring about the side storylines, but that second go around, it hits different, and so you get to appreciate these more subtle elements, those more interesting ideas and storylines. But yeah, enough on that. A little while ago, we talked in depth about Penelope and whether or not she's a compelling and believable main protagonist, and a lot of that hate towards her, it largely stemmed from a few instances. The Marina saga, and then the Eloise stuff from Season 2, and I came to the consensus that whilst Penelope's definitely made mistakes, and is not always the character who's morally right in every single situation, I think it simply makes her more sympathetic as a protagonist, more compelling because she has agency, and sometimes she makes mistakes, she does the wrong thing, she can be selfish, and this to me makes her feel like a well-rounded and human character. So when people twist themselves into knots to defend all of her actions and blame everybody else instead, or when they cry about how since she made a couple of mistakes she's now horrible and ruined forever, I do question what these people are like in their own personal lives.
Wait a minute! Who are you?
And I think that some of the most fervent and frothing bias on both sides of the equation, it often tends to verge on media illiteracy.
Are you a budgie? Is that how basic your biology is?
And it's going to go from this into bloody House of the Dragon. Not exactly excited for the ridiculous Stan Wars there either. It's going to be a bloodbath. But I digress, that's for another day. But anyway, Penn. We did Penn. And so I wanted to take another look at the character of Colin, because I too have seen some complaints about his character. Specifically the path that his character took in the last season. Now I haven't read the books, and I'll be real, I'm not gonna read the books. I'm sure they're decent enough, but I think I'll stick with the show. So I don't really know what Colin's whole vibe was in the book, but in the show, at least in Season 3, there's been a lot of pushback surrounding some of his more recent actions, e.g. visiting the brothel on the regular to pay for three-ways. And I too was a bit put off by it in my first watch through. Like, I don't know, on the surface of it, I don't like the rake characters. I find them to be very cringe, based on a lame power fantasy. Their whole vibe to me is, ooh, look, I use and objectify women, but I'm also the romantic lead, and one of these sweet, innocent virgins is going to fix me and make me a better man whilst I dazzle her with my sexual abilities. Of course, only I can be promiscuous, they can't be. I won't marry a whore, after all. And then that's that. Gives me the ick. And I did get that vibe with Colin at first. Oh, what can we do to make him seem like a real Giga Chad? Oh, I know. How about we have a couple of scenes where he's having orgies with prostitutes? It's the height of cool, truly. What a Chad. And so for me, for him to go from that to him being madly in love with Penn in the same season came off as very cringe and forced. Not very romantically compelling in the slightest. And I think a lot of people have had that same perspective on both his character, and indeed his arc so far this season. It makes him feel try-hard, and it did feel somewhat out of character for the person that we'd seen for 2 seasons prior. And so when I came into that second rewatch, I was sort of expecting it to be very much the same vibe, the same sort of cringy experience, but honestly I think that they've actually attempted something that a lot of people have overlooked, or at least they have in the places I frequent. This might be all old news to you, but I think it's becoming very clear that the entirety of his arc across the entire show's run has been of a young man trying to find his place in society and struggling against and falling prey to and then finally overcoming the constraints of toxic masculinity within the world he inhabits. And sometimes even within his own family. And I guess we'd better start from Season 1, correct? When we first meet Colin, he seems to be a fairly kind-hearted, sweet and sensitive young man. He's not one who's like a lot of the other men in the ton. He's kind enough to always ask Penn to dance, so she gets some sort of social interaction at the balls and gatherings and doesn't look like a complete failure. He's kind, he's charming, he's engaged with his family, he's sweet and generous. Even singing that little song with Francesca in Season 1. That's his vibe. It's clear he's not meant to be the same sort of man as the prototypical rake. Men who in the ton seem to be all the rage. The type of man that a lot of men are expected to become. The type of man that indulges in his vices for many, many years. But he goes the opposite way. He tries to marry somewhat young when he meets Marina, and he becomes completely and utterly infatuated with her. To the point that he proposes marriage right out of the gate. Now, in this stage of his journey, I think it's fair to call this the Mr. Bingley phase. He meets a beautiful young woman who he thinks he could be very happy with and thus decides he wants to marry her. And of course she agrees for reasons that are more pragmatic rather than romantic, but that's neither here nor there. It's not relevant to the discussion. But from his POV, whilst he barely knows her, He gets swept up in that chivalrous love, the classical Regency romance, love at first sight. And like every single Bingley type, he has a Mr. Darcy type to bring his ass back down to earth. And that's in the form of his brother Anthony. Now don't get me wrong, I do not consider Mr. Darcy and Anthony to be all that similar as people, but they play a similar role for their friend/brother figure. And that is to tell them they're being stupid. But the way they do so is obviously completely different. Mr. Darcy's perspective is that Jane is poor and her family is trashy, but Anthony's is far more rooted in, well, toxic masculinity. He scorns his brother for being a fool in love, with lines such as,
"If this is simply a matter of wetting your wick,
and
this is what comes of not sowing your wild oats."
Pretty much saying, you're an idiot, why are you getting married to this absolute nobody? You should be out on the town getting hammered, doing drugs, and having lots and lots of sex with prostitutes, actresses, singers, widows, sometimes unhappily married people. It's the Regency, little brother, enjoy it. Honestly, if you're not bringing at least one sexually transmitted illness into your future marriage, as a gentleman in the Georgian period, have you even lived? So rake it up, son. So already we see that Colin is up against it, and that his more idealistic and romantic perspective is one that is seen as undesirable from other men of his social standing, like his brother. And as we see across seasons 2 and 3, his friends as well. But at first, he digs his heels in. He calls his brother an arsehole.
You really are an ass, do you know that?
He resolves to be a different sort of man. And when Marina is then revealed to have been playing him for a fool and was pregnant with her dead lover's baby, well, I think from a certain point of view it could be argued that it somewhat proved Anthony's words right. He was being a fool. He was getting taken for a ride. And so I think this is where he starts to question his perspective, give in to the toxic side of this era. That perspective that men are supposed to live large and damn the consequences. So he goes off on his grand tour at the end of the season. He doesn't return until season 2. And when he does return, he isn't that different just yet. It's clear he's a little bit, but it's hard to describe how. He's just slightly different. But at the core of him, he still feels like the same person. Remember, all the things he talks about of his travels, they're more cultural experiences thus far. Remember, he has that nice bonding sesh with Sir Philip. But that element of boyish sensitivity is still there. They chat about plants, the places Colin's been to, become very friendly. But here he gets his kick up the arse again. After the sad blow of his brother being right about Marina and thus pushing him towards a more roguish and carefree lifestyle, he goes to see her. And don't get me wrong, I'm not hating on her, but she does kind of shit on him. She pretty much tells him, because he's trying to be kind and gallant and check on her whilst also making his peace and apologising to her, she tells him to get over himself, that life ain't a fairy tale, grow up essentially. And I suspect that this might be one of the big catalysts for his most recent shift. His big adventures abroad, where he goes off into the big wide world of Europe, city after city, and lives life, becoming the classic romance novel protagonist, a globe-trotting playboy with a heart of gold underneath it all. And in turn leads to him exhibiting behaviours that we're not used to. And it starts with him telling the boys at the party that he would never ever court Pen. And I think that's the beginning of his fall into that toxic side of the ton. He's been beaten down from every direction. He's been humbled, he's been humiliated, and so now he just wants to be one of the boys and get his happy ending like that, to fit in, to chase the happiness after all. Look at what he's just seen. The previous year, longtime rake Simon married his sister and lives happily now with their children. And then his older brother, the same brother who talked relentless shit to him about needing to sow his oats the previous season and had obviously been doing so for years, just got his happy ending too. And his other older brother, Benedict, is living a rather happy life of art and promiscuity. So I could see Colin thinking, oh shit, they have found the formula. They were right about this. This is what I should be doing. I have to be like that to be happy. And so he tries to do so. He goes to Europe, another grand tour, never settling anywhere for long, not planning routes. A new city every week, a new woman every week, country after country. And when he gets back to England, he's in the brothels, he's going on adventures, drinking with the boys, getting hammered every night, chasing revelry.
Revelry in the dark.
Chasing skirts, that's the life he's living. And so now, on that second rewatch, with all this added context, I think his sudden shift, when he realises that he's in love with Pen, it's very compelling because it shows him, no, this lifestyle's bullshit, it's not what I want. It's not for me, and I find it hollow and lonely. And so he has to sit and watch the prostitutes. He doesn't want to be with them anymore. He questions his friends. He gets mocked for it. And this in turn leads into his romance with Pen kicking off truly. Leads to him going back to his roots of who he is as a person. And when you look at it like that, with all 3 seasons worth of stories for his character, I think it actually makes a rather compelling storyline of a man who falls into bad habits and bad influences, trying to be like the men he thinks have it all figured out. And so he tries to change himself, to figure himself out and find that happiness, only to realise that the path to happiness was in front of him all along, that he didn't have to force himself to change and do things he didn't want to do to earn her love. And maybe it wasn't intended to be that way from the writers, who knows? But that's what I've taken away from it, and I think, based on that, it's one of the show's more interesting story arcs to me. And I'm curious to see what direction it's going to go in going forward. We haven't finished the season yet, so they might explore this idea a bit more obviously in the second part. Especially as he has to deal with people that are going to be shocked that he's even marrying Penn in the first place. So it's actually made me a lot more hyped for the second part to see where they go with his storyline, but then there's also so much more to cover with Penn, the whole Lady Whistledown drama, plus the Eloise fractured friendship, Cressida, and everything else. So, who knows, it might just be one of those subtle storylines you can enjoy in retrospect. And I really wasn't expecting to be coming to Colin's defense, but I just couldn't help but appreciate the nuanced writing of his character, and how he was seemingly pressured into a role he didn't want to fill in the first place. But yeah, I could very well also be just over-analysing everything in my desperation for part 2, which should be hours away by the time this video releases. So with all that being said, that's the end of the video, and these have all just been my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of Colin's arc? Are you with me that in this new light it's actually rather compelling, or am I full of shit and just making up connections where none exist? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.